April 30th, 1945. A grey dawn over Berlin. The city lay in ruins, smoke curling from shattered rooftops, ash drifting like snow. Inside fortified offices and bombed-out bunkers, Nazi leaders shuffled papers, whispered orders, and argued over maps. Some were hailed as geniuses, others fools in fine uniforms. Boots clicked across cracked floors, pens scratched across files. The weight of war pressed down on every mind. And yet, in the quiet chaos, an unexpected question lingered. How smart were these men really? IQ tests, expert analyses, and history itself would give answers that were sometimes surprising, sometimes shocking. This was not rumor, it was measured, calculated, and it revealed truths about the minds behind Hitler's regime that few had ever considered. Stay with me, watch the full story, and don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. The question of intelligence in Nazi Germany was not just academic, it was deeply tied to the horror they created. March 1945, Europe was in ruins, cities burned, armies collapsing, and yet a handful of men still held almost absolute power. Could these men, who commanded millions, orchestrated entire wars, and unleashed unimaginable cruelty, be considered intelligent? The answer was not as simple as it seemed. The US Army, in its effort to understand the psychology of the captured Nazi leaders, began a series of tests at the end of the war. Among them was the Nuremberg trial group, men who had been accused of crimes so terrible they had seemed almost inhuman. Psychologists and intelligence officers examined them not just for guilt, but for insight. One of the tools they used was the intelligence quotient, or IQ, a measure of problem-solving ability, reasoning, and general intelligence. Yet IQ alone was never meant to define a person's worth, genius, or even their capability as a leader. It was a scale, a number designed to classify thought, logic, and adaptability. One might command armies and plan invasions, but score only average on a test. Conversely, a man might appear modest, hidden behind administrative tasks, yet score higher than expected, showing keen analytical skill. This paradox, the tension between outward power and inner intelligence, set the stage for an extraordinary examination. The tests administered at Nuremberg included a combination of written assessments, problem-solving exercises, and interviews designed to measure not just raw memory, but the ability to reason and adapt. For instance, Julius Streicher, publisher of the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, showed remarkable fervor and ideological conviction, yet his IQ measured only 106, barely above average. His brilliance in manipulation was real, but it had little to do with cognitive reasoning. Cotton Brunner, an Austrian giant and SS general, head of the Reich Main Security Office controlling the Gestapo, the SD, and criminal police, scored 113. Again, above average, yet far from genius. The paradox was striking. Men capable of extraordinary brutality often did not demonstrate the intellectual sophistication one might expect. Witness accounts from the time described a curious mix of cunning and naivety. Some leaders displayed cleverness in planning bureaucratic or military strategies. Others, while intelligent, were trapped by ideology, unable to see the obvious mistakes in Hitler's decisions. As the psychologists noted, intelligence could coexist with moral blindness. A brilliant mind could still commit unspeakable crimes, proving that IQ measured only one facet of a human being, the ability to think, reason, and solve abstract problems, not their humanity. The Nuremberg evaluations also highlighted the contrast between perception and reality. To the soldiers, prisoners, and public, these men had been terrifying, nearly superhuman in their power, yet the numbers told a different story. Many were average, some slightly above, a few truly clever, but none beyond human measure. This was a reminder. Power does not always equal intelligence, and cruelty does not always come from genius. Understanding these men required context. The world saw them as architects of terror, but behind closed doors, they could be measured, quantified, and analyzed. This process, balancing the terror they inspired with the IQ numbers assigned, laid the groundwork for ranking them, exploring who was clever, who was merely ambitious, and who reached the top through opportunity, ideology, or chance, rather than extraordinary mental ability. But this was only the beginning. The story would move from average minds to the truly cunning, tracing the path of those whose intelligence allowed them to rise higher, plan more efficiently, and perhaps, in some cases, miscalculate in ways that changed history. In the end, it would reveal a paradox that still fascinates historians. The cleverest men in Nazi Germany were often those whose brilliance was shadowed by horror. Before ranking the Nazi leaders, it's important to understand what IQ really measures. IQ, or intelligence quotient, is a number designed to evaluate reasoning, problem-solving, and general mental ability. During World War II, it was considered one of the best ways to quantify intelligence, though it was far from perfect. It could not measure morality, creativity, or leadership in full. It only tested logic, memory, and how quickly someone could grasp ideas. The average IQ is set at 100. Roughly 34% of the population falls between 90 and 110, meaning they think and reason at a normal, average level. Scores above 110 indicate above average intelligence, and 120 or more is considered well above average. Scores under 100 are below average, and below 70 may suggest serious cognitive difficulties. These numbers provide a framework for comparison, a way to judge mental skill on a scale that psychologists could use consistently. When the US Army conducted IQ tests on captured Nazi leaders at Nuremberg, the results were surprising. Some of the men who had inspired fear across Europe were only slightly above average. Others, seemingly less intimidating, scored much higher. For example, Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper publisher, measured just 106, a score barely above average. His ability to influence masses was real, but it did not stem from extraordinary intelligence. Meanwhile, men like Himmler, who commanded the SS with precision and ruthlessness, scored between 130 and 140, a clear indicator of high intellectual ability. IQ alone, however, does not explain why some leaders succeeded and others failed. Intelligence is only one part of leadership, and context matters. The structure of the Nazi regime allowed certain men to rise due to loyalty, ideology, or opportunity rather than brilliance. Hitler himself never took an IQ test, but experts estimate it to have been around 140. That put him among the cleverest, yet his decisions often showed overconfidence and miscalculation, particularly in military strategy. This paradox, high IQ paired with flawed judgment, would become a recurring theme in analyzing Nazi leaders. Another striking observation was the contrast between bureaucratic intelligence and battlefield intelligence. Some men excelled in administration and organization, but lacked military insight. Others, like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, showed technical competence, but limited independent thinking. The IQ tests helped highlight these distinctions. They allowed historians and psychologists to separate pure cognitive ability from practical wisdom, tactical skill, and moral reasoning. Even the Allied leaders can be compared in this context. Winston Churchill, for example, is estimated to have had an IQ around 150, while Franklin D. Roosevelt likely scored about 140. Joseph Stalin, though never formally tested, is believed to have had an IQ of roughly 130. The comparisons revealed that intelligence is relative. It helps in planning, problem-solving, and governance, but it is never a guarantee of ethical behavior or historical success. For viewers, understanding the IQ scale is key. It gives a lens to examine the Nazi hierarchy, allowing us to ask, who was clever, who relied on loyalty and fear, and who made decisions that shaped the course of history? The numbers provide a map, but the human story, the ambition, ideology, cruelty, and occasional misjudgment fills in the landscape. With the scale and context in place, we can now start ranking the leaders, from those with average scores who achieved infamy through zeal and brutality, to the men whose high intelligence made them both effective and terrifying. This ranking will reveal a fascinating spectrum: power, intellect, and horror intertwined in ways that still surprise historians today. Now that we understand what IQ measures, it's time to meet the men at the lower end of the intelligence scale among Nazi leaders. These were not fools, but compared to others in the regime, their mental abilities were average, sometimes surprisingly ordinary for men whose names still shock history. The first on our list is Julius Streicher. Streicher was a publisher and politician known for his virulently anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer. He was loud, cruel, and relentless in spreading Nazi ideology, yet his IQ was just 106, barely above average. According to historians, his influence came not from intelligence, but from relentless energy, propaganda skills, and an ability to manipulate fear. In his own diary, Streicher boasted of his work shaping public opinion, but the numbers suggest that strategy was less about brilliance and more about persistence. His actions were terrifying, but his mind was not extraordinary. Next comes Dr. Cotton Brunner, the SS general who oversaw the Reich Main Security Office, controlling the Gestapo, criminal police, and SD Brunner was physically imposing, with a scarred face and austere presence. On the IQ scale, he scored 113. This placed him just below the above-average category. His intelligence helped him manage complex bureaucracy. But it didn't make him a visionary or strategist. He followed orders with precision, and that obedience, rather than cleverness, defined his role in the Nazi machine. Rudolf Hess is a more surprising case. Hitler's deputy until 1941, Hess suddenly flew to Scotland in a bizarre attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. His IQ measured 120, well into the above-average range. Yet Hess's actions show that even a high IQ could not always prevent poor judgment or irrational decisions. He was intelligent, yes, but his choices were reckless, and history remembers him as both brilliant and bizarre. These early rankings reveal an important paradox. High intelligence does not equal moral clarity, nor does average intelligence prevent a person from causing immense harm. Streicher and Brunner were relatively ordinary men in IQ terms, yet their zeal and positions allowed them to perpetrate atrocities. Hess, with his above-average mind, made decisions that baffled allies and Nazis alike. The spectrum of intellect within the regime was wide, yet destructive potential did not always correlate with intelligence. Even in this lower IQ range, the sensory reality of their environment mattered. These leaders lived amid reports, documents, and bureaucratic procedures, often smelling ink, paper, and the faint tang of disinfectants in offices. Their work was methodical, routine, and driven by ideology rather than innovation. The corridors of power were filled with orders, telegrams, and the constant hum of secretarial machines. Intelligence, measured in IQ, allowed them to organize and enforce, but it did not guarantee foresight or wisdom. As we move up the scale, the next leaders demonstrate that slightly higher IQs brought a different kind of influence. They could strategize more effectively, foresee consequences, and exert power through intellect as much as through fear. Men like Walter Funk, Reich's Minister of Economy and President of the Reichsbank, and Konstantin von Neurath, diplomat and protector of occupied Czech lands, show this combination of intelligence and authority. Funk scored 124, Neurath 125, placing them solidly above average. They were clever administrators, yet they too were bound by ideology, showing again that intellect alone could not prevent complicity in atrocities. From these examples, we begin to see a pattern. Average men could commit horrific acts, clever men could plan efficiently, and the truly dangerous combination was high intelligence fused with ruthless ideology. This spectrum will only become clearer as we rank the next leaders, where intellect starts to rival power and ambition in shaping history. As we move higher on the intelligence scale, we find Nazi leaders whose IQs were clearly above average. These men were clever enough to manage complex operations, influence policy, and manipulate both allies and enemies. Yet intelligence, measured in numbers, did not protect them from moral failure, or from the catastrophic consequences of their own ideology. Walter Funk, Reich's Minister of Economy and President of the Reichsbank, had an IQ of 124. Funk was a man of detail, responsible for financing Germany's war machine. He could balance budgets, control economic production, and make calculations that influenced millions. But intelligence alone did not make him a moral actor. Diaries from contemporaries note that Funk worked tirelessly on economic plans with the precision of a mathematician, yet he remained blind or indifferent to the suffering his policies caused. The smell of ink, paper, and cigars filled his office, the constant ticking of clocks marking the rhythm of bureaucracy that fed a violent regime. Slightly higher was Konstantin von Neurath, a diplomat and protector of the occupied Czech lands. His IQ was measured at 125, placing him firmly in the above-average category. Neurath's intelligence allowed him to navigate the complicated world of international diplomacy while enforcing Nazi control in occupied territories. He was skilled at negotiation and at maintaining an image of authority. Yet, like Funk, intelligence did not equal morality. The same mind that could write polished reports for Hitler could also approve policies that oppressed millions. A paradox emerges here. The cleverer they were, the more efficient their cruelty could become. Alfred Rosenberg and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, both with IQs of 127, pushed this pattern further. Rosenberg, the chief Nazi ideologue and foreign policy leader, shaped the intellectual justification for much of the regime's brutality. Jodl, as chief of the operations staff for the Armed Forces High Command, planned campaigns with precision. Their offices were filled with maps, military reports, and documents smelling faintly of dust and gun oil. They understood strategy, logistics, and propaganda alike. Intelligence allowed them to plan operations that were terrifying in their efficiency, but it did not stop them from making morally horrific decisions. Even the Reich's architect and Minister for Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, scored 128 on IQ tests, the top end of above-average intelligence. Speer was a master organizer, able to optimize production, streamline factories, and supervise tens of thousands of workers. Diaries revealed that Speer's mind was always active. "Plans flowed through me like water," he wrote, describing the constant calculations and forecasts he made. Yet, despite his brilliance, he admitted later to being blind to the suffering around me. Here again, intelligence did not bring insight or conscience. These examples show an important truth. Higher IQ allowed Nazi leaders to operate more effectively, yet intelligence did not equal morality. Paradoxically, those who were cleverest could be the most efficient in executing cruel policies. They calculated, predicted, and executed plans that were devastating in their consequences. Even sensory details matter. The smell of coal in factories, the metallic tang of weaponry, the soft rustle of orders being signed, all were part of a system run by intelligent minds without ethical guidance. As we climb further, the next group of leaders pushes this pattern to extremes. Men like Joachim von Ribbentrop and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, with IQs of 129, combined strategic ability with political ambition. Their cleverness made them powerful, but also made their mistakes more impactful. The world would soon see the consequences of intellect untempered by morality, and the path towards the top ranks of Nazi intelligence is both fascinating and chilling. At the very top of the Nazi intelligence scale, we meet the leaders whose IQs approached what experts might call genius levels. These men were not just organizers or planners, they were thinkers, strategists, and manipulators, capable of influencing millions with both words and actions. Yet intelligence alone could not save them from the moral abyss they inhabited. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, is estimated to have had an IQ of around 130. Goebbels' mind was sharp and calculating. He understood psychology, media, and the power of symbols in a way few could. His speeches could rally crowds, his propaganda could shape public opinion, and his plans for controlling German thought were meticulous. Diaries describe the office he occupied, cluttered with papers, film reels, and photographs. A hive of ideas and obsession, as one aide recalled. Goebbels' intelligence was undeniable, but it was used to manipulate, deceive, and enforce terror. The paradox is clear. Brilliance in communication became a weapon of control and fear. The same IQ level applies to Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Himmler, whose IQ is estimated between 130 and 140, was a man obsessed with order, ritual, and ideology. He could manage vast bureaucracies, oversee complex logistical operations, and maintain detailed records of the SS and concentration camps. Witnesses noted Himmler's meticulous nature, from the crispness of his uniforms to the precise way he reviewed reports. The scent of polished floors, leather-bound files, and the faint metallic tang of the office's typewriters marked the spaces he controlled. Intelligence enabled Himmler to turn systems of death into highly organized machinery. Hans Frank, in charge of occupied Poland, also had an IQ of 130. He combined legal knowledge with administrative skill, managing territories with strict efficiency. Observers described him as coldly rational, capable of solving complex problems while simultaneously enforcing policies that caused widespread suffering. Baldur von Schirach, Hitler youth leader and later governor of Vienna, similarly had a measured IQ of 130. He was strategic in propaganda, organizational structure, and political maneuvering, molding youth into instruments of the regime's vision. Even in the Navy, intelligence mattered. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the German Navy until 1943, had an IQ of 134. His calculations of naval tactics, fleet movements, and supply logistics were precise. Yet intelligence in isolation could not prevent strategic failures or the eventual collapse of Germany's naval ambitions. His successor, Karl Dönitz, measured at 138, demonstrated similar acumen. He was methodical, disciplined, and able to execute complex U-boat strategies that threatened Allied shipping. But intellect, even in war, could not overcome overwhelming opposition or flawed moral choices. Finally, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and Minister-President of Prussia, also had a tested IQ of 138. His brilliance in logistics, strategy, and resource management was evident in both military campaigns and economic schemes. Yet witnesses often described him as indulgent and egotistical. The paradox is striking. A man of remarkable intellect, capable of complex planning, yet blinded by personal ambition and ethical failure. These examples make one point painfully clear. High intelligence allowed Nazi leaders to execute more complicated plans, manipulate masses, and maintain bureaucracies, but it did not bring conscience or morality. Their minds were powerful, yet the systems they built were instruments of oppression. The stage is now set to look at Adolf Hitler himself and the intelligence estimates surrounding the man who led them all. The tension between raw intellect and moral corruption reaches its peak here as we explore the genius and the danger of Hitler's mind. Adolf Hitler. The name itself evokes fear, obsession, and a strange fascination. But how clever was he? Unlike many of his lieutenants, Hitler was never formally tested for IQ, yet historians, psychologists, and experts have estimated his intelligence to be around 140. That placed him at the top tier of the Nazi hierarchy in terms of raw intellectual ability. Still, intelligence alone does not measure wisdom or morality. Hitler's genius was tactical and political, but it came with devastating consequences. Hitler's strength lay in persuasion. Witnesses described his speeches as magnetic, hypnotic, and almost trance-like. Soldiers, civilians, and party members alike were drawn to his words. He understood human psychology and fear better than many generals of his time. One aide wrote that Hitler could read the moods of a crowd like an open book, adjusting his tone, pace, and gestures to maximize impact. But this skill, paired with ideology, became a tool of manipulation, not enlightenment. He could sway millions without the need for formal reasoning, an intellect honed in the school of oratory and obsession strategically. Hitler was a mix of brilliance and blunder. Early on, his ideas seemed visionary. The rapid expansion of Germany in the late 1930s, including the annexation of Austria and occupation of Czechoslovakia, displayed foresight, planning, and boldness. Yet his overreach, invading the Soviet Union in 1941 and declaring war on the United States, showed the limits of even a sharp mind when blinded by ideology and arrogance. Intelligence, in Hitler's case, was never divorced from obsession. The scent of burning paper from endless planning sessions, the clatter of maps spread across tables, and the tension in his private office all reveal a man consumed by strategy, yet increasingly detached from reality. To understand Hitler's intellect in context, we can compare him to other high IQ Nazis. Himmler, Göring, Dönitz, and Goebbels all operated within their domains, managing logistics, propaganda, or military strategy. Hitler's intelligence, however, was overarching. He was the final decision-maker, the strategic visionary, or, as critics argue, the fatal architect of errors. His IQ estimate of 140 aligns with this: clever enough to plan large-scale operations, but flawed by hubris and moral blindness. Experts also note his talent for manipulation extended beyond speeches. Hitler carefully curated his image, appearing humble, approachable, or menacing as needed. Visitors to his Berlin office described it as meticulously clean, with a faint smell of cigars and ink, a room where every detail seemed deliberate, reflecting a mind that calculated appearances as carefully as strategy diaries from officers reveal both admiration and fear. Admiration for his ability to command loyalty, and fear for the consequences of disobeying his will. The paradox is striking. Hitler's intelligence made him a master of perception, yet he could miscalculate entire theaters of war. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the delays in production for critical weapons show that intellect alone cannot compensate for obsession, ideological rigidity, or moral corruption. Even the cleverest Nazi minds could not correct his mistakes once they were in motion. Understanding Hitler's IQ sets the stage for the final comparison. Allied leaders. How did Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin measure up against the Nazi elite? The contrast is revealing, offering insight not just into cleverness, but into leadership, decision-making, and moral responsibility. The next section explores this comparison, highlighting how raw intelligence meets vision, ethics, and circumstance. With the Nazi leaders ranked by IQ, it is time to widen the lens and compare them to the Allies. Intelligence alone does not decide the outcome of wars, but it gives context to leadership, strategy, and decision-making under pressure. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, for example, is often remembered for his speeches, resilience, and vision. Experts have estimated his IQ around 150, higher than any Nazi leader. But what does that mean in practice? Churchill's intellect combined with courage, creativity, and practical problem-solving allowed him to rally Britain in its darkest hours. His mind processed complex military, political, and social problems simultaneously, a true polymath navigating the chaos of total war. Across the Atlantic, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had an estimated IQ of 140, comparable to Hitler's. Roosevelt's brilliance lay not in military strategy, but in vision, diplomacy, and the ability to mobilize resources. He understood both the economic and psychological aspects of leadership behind closed doors. Aides recalled Roosevelt's sharp mind as capable of quickly understanding complex reports, weighing options, and anticipating consequences. Unlike Hitler, however, Roosevelt's intellect was paired with flexibility. He listened to advisors, adapted plans, and balanced power carefully, traits that amplified his high intelligence into effective leadership rather than disaster. Then there was Joseph Stalin. Experts have guessed his IQ at around 130. Stalin's mind was ruthless, calculating, and deeply strategic. Yet it was guided more by paranoia than persuasion. He reorganized nations, eliminated enemies, and wielded terror as a tool of governance. In contrast to the Nazis' intellectual experiments with ideology and propaganda, Stalin's intelligence served control. His actions illustrate an important lesson. IQ is not morality. A clever mind can be used to create prosperity, manipulate populations, or destroy millions. This comparison highlights a striking paradox. The most intelligent leaders were not always the most successful in human terms. Hitler's IQ may have been high, but his obsession with ideology, expansion, and personal power led to catastrophic errors. Churchill, Roosevelt, and even Stalin, while clever, paired intellect with calculation, caution, or flexibility, factors that made their decisions more effective. In the end, raw IQ mattered less than how intelligence was applied under pressure. The contrast is made even more vivid by examining the scope of decisions each leader faced. Hitler directed military campaigns, party politics, and the extermination of millions. Churchill balanced defense, public morale, and international diplomacy, while leading a nation on the brink of collapse. Roosevelt oversaw a global war effort, mobilized the economy, and built alliances across continents. Stalin, ruthless and cunning, managed the largest country in the world through fear and calculation. Intelligence interacts with circumstance, resources, and ethical choice, shaping outcomes far beyond a number on a test. Interestingly, the IQ numbers reveal unexpected truths about Nazi leaders. Many were not simple-minded fanatics as often assumed. Himmler, Goebbels, and even Dönitz possessed intellectual abilities on par with some Allied leaders, yet they applied them toward ideology and oppression. Hitler's intellect, though formidable, became destructive when untempered by ethics or counsel. The Allied leaders, in contrast, leveraged intellect toward coordination, strategy, and nation-building. This contrast reminds us that intelligence is not just mental agility, it is also vision, judgment, and moral orientation. In the end, comparing Nazis and Allies through IQ offers a lens into the war itself. It explains some successes, many failures, and the enduring paradox of clever minds used for evil or for survival. It is a reminder that the sharpest mind does not always win, but the combination of intelligence, adaptability, and ethical judgment shapes history. Next, we conclude our exploration by looking at the patterns, lessons, and ultimate legacy of intelligence in the Third Reich and its enemies. We will see how cleverness, morality, and leadership intersected on the world stage. As we reach the final layer of this story, it is clear that intelligence in the Nazi hierarchy and among the Allied leaders was only part of the puzzle. Numbers on IQ tests give us a measure of mental sharpness, problem-solving, and memory. But history shows that how intelligence was used mattered far more than the scores themselves. In the Third Reich, brilliant minds like Himmler, Goebbels, and even Dönitz applied their intelligence to control, propaganda, and strategic planning, often with devastating consequences. Their cleverness served ideology, fear, and personal power rather than constructive problem-solving or moral responsibility. In contrast, Allied leaders transformed intellect into coordination, vision, and resilience. Churchill's speeches inspired millions, Roosevelt's strategies mobilized a nation, and even Stalin's ruthless calculation contributed to an end to Nazi expansion. The paradox is striking. Some of the Nazis with very high IQs caused destruction, while Allied leaders of similar or slightly higher intelligence used theirs to organize, protect, and ultimately defeat the Axis. This demonstrates that intelligence alone does not determine outcomes. It is tempered by vision, ethics, and adaptability. Looking deeper, the IQ rankings among Nazis reveal unexpected truths. Many assumed that fanatics and criminals lacked intelligence. The reality is that some of the most notorious figures were highly intelligent, often rivaling or surpassing their enemies in pure mental capability. Himmler's mind, measured between 130 and 140, was exceptional. Goebbels, estimated at 130, was a master manipulator of information and public opinion. Even Dönitz, Hitler's successor, had an IQ of 138, showing that the leadership of the Third Reich was not simply composed of fools, but of men who used sharp minds for dangerous ends. Yet intelligence without ethics or strategy beyond ideology becomes self-defeating. Hitler's own estimated IQ of 140 shows he was exceptionally smart, but his obsession with conquest, anti-Semitic ideology, and personal dominance led to catastrophic decisions. Military campaigns faltered, alliances crumbled, and his nation faced ruin. By contrast, intelligence combined with moral judgment or practical flexibility, as seen in Churchill and Roosevelt, created leadership that could endure crises and achieve results. The lesson is clear. IQ is a tool, not a guarantee, and the application of intelligence defines its historical impact. Finally, stepping back from individuals to nations, we can see a broader legacy. Nazi Germany had clever leaders, but their brilliance was channeled toward cruelty and destruction. The Allies, often just as intelligent, leveraged their minds for coordination, innovation, and perseverance. In the end, the story of intelligence in World War II is a story of contrasts: cleverness versus conscience, raw mental power versus wisdom in action, and destructive genius versus constructive leadership. They had been measured, ranked, and analyzed. Some were terrifyingly brilliant, others surprisingly average. Yet in the wider scope of history, the cleverest leaders were those who paired intellect with vision, strategy, and ethical sense. They had come as conquerors, manipulators, or rulers, but the war's outcome showed that intelligence without direction is dangerous, while intelligence with guidance can change the world. In the end, the Third Reich's greatest minds left a legacy not of triumph, but of warning. The Allies' intelligence and leadership, paired with resilience, turned the tide. And the lesson remains timeless. A sharp mind is a powerful weapon, but it is only as effective as the purpose it serves. Intelligence in World War II tells a story of paradox. Nazi leaders often possessed high IQs, capable of planning, strategy, and manipulation, yet their brilliance was used for destruction, ideology, and terror. Allied leaders, with similar or slightly higher intelligence, applied their minds toward coordination, vision, and survival. The war demonstrates that IQ alone does not dictate history. Application, ethics, and adaptability do. It reminds us that cleverness can build or destroy, inspire or oppress. By studying these leaders, we see that intelligence is not just about numbers. It is about how it is applied and the consequences that follow. In the end, history favors those who pair sharp minds with wisdom and vision.